Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Good morning. Able to hear me? The voice is all clear. Awesome. Okay. So, guys, see, in yesterday's class, so, guys, see, in yesterday's class, we were actually discussing about um, the French threat to the colonies, right? At a time when the colonies actually wanted to assert their own existence or their own sort of rights, there was obviously the French threat to the colonies. The French were on the verge of probably attacking the colonies, and that is what actually led to many of the colonial leaders to actually avoid um, the direct confrontation with the crown, right? Why people actually avoided direct confrontation with the crown is because there was the French threat, and that is what eventually led to 1756 7 years war. That is, the French were aiming to occupy the colonies. They were just looking for the best opportunity, and there the French idea was the minute Britishers remove their sort of hand of protection on the colonies, these French could actually invade the colonies and take over the colonies. That way, the French would sort of have an easy way and less, you can say, opposition to attack. Right? That was the eventual idea. Now, the French were actually in the central hinterlands, the central lands, and the French threat was actually very real. They were in the central lands, and it looked like the French were going to attack. Now, in fact, the French Indian War started, also called the 7 Years' War. The 7 Years' War remains the most significant. It was fought between English and French over control of land in North America. See, French and English were actually involved in a dispute with each other from the very beginning. So, this was not the first time they were actually both fighting. French and English were continuously involved in a dispute with each other, and not just in India. They were actually fighting for colonial authority or imperialism across the globe, not just here. So the English wanted to push west. I mean, the Gore Langur wanted to go west into American mainland. Why say the French Langur wanted to come into the eastern coastal lands? Oh yes, you can say I always call it continental romance. So it was beyond boundaries. The war started over land dispute between the two nations of France and England. 7 years war hua tha, 1756 to 1763. France was trying to enter the British American colonies, and Britain or British America was trying to enter the French colonies. Good morning, Bernica. And the first Carnatic War was also actually part of this. The French eventually got Quebec. Sorry, the third Carnatic War eventually was there, and three wars were fought now between Carnatic. That was actually part of these French-Indian rivalry only. England won the war. Now French lost the colonies in North America. Now, आप बताओ. You tell me. See, who were the who were the parties who were fighting the 7 years war? Who were the parties which were fighting the 7 years war? Guys, which were the parties which were fighting the 7 years war? English and French. Now, English were fighting to protect whom? Good morning, Subrani. English were actually fighting to protect whom? White American colonies, no? So, and in reality, who actually owns the white American colonies? Who set up the white American colonies? Who set up these colonies? The 13 colonies? The Britishers, right? So, don't you think there is nothing new Britain is doing? Britain is actually protecting its own asset. Which Britain is not doing something extra, right? Don't you think it is the responsibility of the British to actually protect these colonies? There is nothing new here. But Britain did not felt that way. Britain was like, we protected you from French, so now pay more taxation. That is where the entire problem started. You understood? So once the French were sort of defeated, Britain said the war was expensive. American colonies now have to pay more taxes. Already, American colonies were frustrated that they were paying too much of taxes. Now, American colonies have to pay even more taxes. Exactly. Saikiran, it is totally the responsibility. So, as of 1763, North French problem in North America ended, but England's you could say, approach towards the American colonies also changed. Before 1760, England had generally a softer approach, loose execution of laws. People could defy the law, and by Americans who used to sort of kind of always defy the law, always escape from implementing the laws, and all that used to happen. But after 1760, Britain started imposing extremely tight control on the laws. New, tighter laws were introduced, new punishments were introduced. In fact, things were made extremely difficult. Now, the logic was pretty simple. Britain believed that they have spent money in protecting the 13 colonies from France. So the 13 colonies now have to pay the remaining taxes. Now the 13 colonies logic was, and Britain did not do anything special for us. Britain basically protected its own asset from an invader. So Britain did not do something special. It was American approaches. It was Britain's responsibility to protect us. We are British colonies. Whereas Britain's approach was, no, no, it is, we've done a favor. So now they have to pay up. As of 1763, a tight control policy was introduced by the Crown, by the British. Under this, Americans were instructed they cannot cross Appalachian Mountains because, see, the 13 colonies were at the peak of their geographical territory. This is Appalachian Mountains. 13 colonies were looking for expansion. Not 1763 Treaty of Paris. Prafurna, Treaty of Paris 1763 was different. Now here, for only for America, Britain introduced tight control policy. Under the tight control policy, Britain was saying, Great Britain was saying that American colonialists or American colonials cannot cross Appalachian Mountains. So technically, no more expansions. If there is no more expansions, no more development. If there is no more development, America is no longer a threat to Britain. Right? So Britain was back to its original sadism. And reason was pretty simple. Why Appalachian Mountains was put as a boundary is Americans wanted to expand. Britain wanted to stop them and also show simultaneously conciliatory approach towards Red Indians who were very, very frustrated. I mean, they wanted to show some conciliatory approach towards Red Indians who were actually very frustrated with British policies and British life. Uh, so naturally, with tight control policy, do you think American colonials will really like it? आपको लगता है कि ये उनको पसंद आएगा? Would they even agree with it? The tight control policy. Absolutely no, right? Absolutely no. British Parliament passed a law. Parliament passed new laws saying the colonies have to pay tax, new taxes. In fact, Britain instructed the colonies to raise taxes so that they could raise revenue and pay for the war. As of we call this the Proclamation Act. That is, American settlers can no longer cross the Appalachian Mountains into the Indian territory. They were British checkposts which were established. Nearly 10,000 soldiers were sent to these 13 colonies to enforce the Proclamation Act. 10,000 soldiers. Naturally, American colonists were very angry because now, slowly, the 13 colonies were starting to become a police state under the British. They're converting it into a police state. And many of the colonists still ignored it. They started expansions and relations started to get really bad between these two. Literally, you can see the red line border was sort of established. Things started to get really troubling. And then in 1764, a series of acts were passed. For example, Currency Act. England passed a law requiring all colonists to pay. And also, Americans can no longer use their own currency. They have to use British currency. Until then, Americans had their own currency. That was banned. British restricted the colonies from printing paper money. They cannot print paper money anymore. Guys, just 1 second. Just 1 second. I'll just be back. 1 second, guys. So, the Currency Act basically restricted American colonies from printing money, and now they have to collect their money directly from London. Now, see, this was basically seen more or less like an unwanted direct interference into their day-to-day affairs, right? And most colonists, which is people of the colony, they actually felt insulted with this. इसके साथ नहीं रुके थे लोग. Then Sugar Act was passed. Americans were compelled to pay extra tax on molasses, particularly sugar and molasses. And see, molasses is central aspect for rum. And rum is the drink of gods, ishkaba, the drink of gods, the drink of heaven. Now, thanks to molasses, rum became very expensive. And if rum is expensive, then nobody is worth living. That was the idea in those days. वहाँ पे रम का कंजम्पशन बहुत ज्यादा होता था. Logic was pretty simple, guys. ये हमेशा याद रख लो. This always you remember. Drinking water और water is very pollutant. Water में बहुत सारे pollutions होते हैं. So if you want to get good drinking water, you need Kent RO water purifier with हेमा मालिनी. पानी को शुद्ध करने के लिए केंट आरओ वाटर प्यूरिफायर भी चाहिए और हेमा मालिनी उसको बेचना भी चाहिए. Rum is not that way. Rum is basically molasses and grape juice rotten to hell. You rot it to the hell. I mean, basically, rum is essentially molasses and grapevine, which first rots, then spoils, then goes to a point where even bacteria, fungus cannot infect. Then we bottle it and drink it. So it's already rotten. तो उसमें खास खराब होने के लिए कुछ नहीं है. That's the reason most people used to drink rum. And molasses is the central base element in this. If you put tax on molasses, you're making rum expensive. And if you're making rum expensive, that's the end of the game in America. People go nuts. So first they brought Currency Act, then they brought Sugar Act, then they brought Quartering Act. Under the Quartering Act, you remember those 10,000 soldiers who were sent? The expenses, the salaries, the maintenance of these 10,000 soldiers must be borne only by the American colonies, not by the British. So British will not pay the salaries for them. So there'll be an army which will occupy you, and you will only pay the expenses of this army. That was the logic here. Americans must pay for the British soldiers posted in America. Exactly. People went nuts. The people were, I mean, out of control now. I mean, the colonists, and see, the problem is these colonists are not these people. The colonists are these people. They are also equally educated, politically active, smart, intelligent people who know about enlightenment and human rights and free speech. So this is not like the Gaon Dehati Babu Bhaiya that you can just bluff him and fool him. You can't fool these guys. Then Stamp Act was passed in 1765, where England said that all documents, all legal documents like bill of sale, contracts, wills, newspapers, cards, anything, if Americans do a trade, they need to pay a tax directly in London. In a way, this was the first direct tax. Until now, it was an indirect tax. Until now, it was an indirect tax which British Parliament was putting. This was for the first time a direct tax. No, and that is where the famous slogan "No taxation without representation" started. Americans began to organize and protest these taxes because yeah, exactly. Subsidiary alliance is very similar to Quartering Act. Yes, later when we see subsidiary alliance, the entire logic here was that any activity you do in your country in America, you need to pay taxes in London. So Americans simply came with a slogan. They said, "It's okay. We'll pay taxes. No problem. Just give us representation in the British Parliament." That is when the famous slogan "No taxation without representation" started. So Americans simply were saying, "हम tax भर देंगे, हमको representation दे दो, MP दे दो British Parliament में." Because 13 colonies were paying taxes now to London. So give us 13 members in London. Now with the Stamp Act, with the Currency Act, colonists were very, very angry. The colonists felt Parliament and the king did not have the right to tax the colonists without colonial representation in the Parliament. I mean, this is what the natural American colonists used to think, that king can actually put tax if the colonists, if American 13 colonies have representation in the British Parliament, then the Parliament can tax them. Otherwise, see, because until now, taxation was really being put by their respective colonial assemblies, right? So all the 13 colonies had their own assemblies. सारे 13 कॉलोनीज के अपने अपने असेंबली थे. तो ये असेंबली को असेंबलीज जो कि डायरेक्टली इलेक्टेड थे, तो टैक्सेशन होता था. अब ये पहली बार डायरेक्ट ब्रिटिश पार्लियामेंट इज आल्सो पुटिंग टैक्सेस. ये प्रॉब्लम था. 9 colonists sent a delegation to New York to discuss the Stamp Act, stated that Parliament did not have any right to tax the colonies. Only the colonial assemblies, which is the 13 colonial assemblies, have the right. In spite of their protest, in spite of their complaint, no response came from the crown. In fact, in return, at that time, the King George said, "I can pass any law on you lot, and there is not a thing you can do about it. मैं जो चाहे वो कर सकता हूं, आप कुछ नहीं कर सकते इसका." Don't you think this was now starting to get to a point of boiling? It was starting to get to the point of boiling. That's why we had no other option. Americans had no other options. So eventually, Samuel Adams, an American leader, Samuel Adams, in 1765, established a political grouping called the Sons of Liberty. It is actually after this Samuel Adams that America is commonly referred to as Uncle Sam. Right? America is called Uncle Sam, Uncle Samuel Adams. The colonists were not happy with the formal protest. They wanted a direct action. Samuel Adams helped to create Sons of Liberty, um, a political organization to actually put across the American complaints appropriately. And most effective protest was actually boycott, very similar to a Swadeshi movement. But we also did this Swadeshi movement. Very rarely they used violence, such as burning a tax collector's home or tarring and feathering. But the idea was to basically boycott everything. Boycott British goods, boycott British. ये actually Uncle Sam. And the boycott movement was amazing in 1766. Burning down house of tax collector, feathering tax collector, tarring or feathering a tax collector, all this was done. Protests were done. When people were putting this protest, British Parliament did not even care and passed one more act called the Townshend Act, named after one of the legislators, Townshend's. Under that, new taxes were put on glass, lead, paper, paint, tea. मतलब दुनिया में जो है सब टैक्स, ये भी टैक्स, वो भी टैक्स, टैक्स पे टैक्स, चाय पे टैक्स, ग्लास पे टैक्स, घर का पेंट करो तो टैक्स, पेंट खरीदो तो टैक्स. यहाँ अमेरिकन कंप्लेंट करे जा रहे हैं और वहां टैक्स डाले जा रहे हैं. Here Americans are complaining and those guys are like tax पे टैक्स, टैक्स पे टैक्स, टैक्स पे टैक्स. हाँ, जीएसटी, मम्मी वाला जीएसटी, डैडी वाला जीएसटी, जीएसटी पे जीएसटी, दुनिया भर का. On top, navigation acts and all the previous acts were starting to get enforced. And you know the beauty of all this? Till now, Americans were protesting but not asking for independence, right? Americans complain कर रहे हैं. What Americans want? Representation in the parliament. That's it. They're not saying Gore Langur down, down, Angrez, America chodo, kuch bhi nahi bol rahe. They're not even asking for independence. They're not even asking for autonomy. They're simply saying, just to give us representation. Isn't this exactly similar to how our moderates were? Wasn't this what even our moderates were saying? That just give us representation. We're not asking for anything. When Sons of Liberty was there, Sons of Liberty in 1770, March 5th, they did a protest against the British government. The colonists threw snowballs at soldiers and taunting them by calling them different names. The British governor of Boston or Massachusetts ordered discipline. Soldiers started firing on the people. 5 members of Sons of Liberty died. Yes. 5 members died and they called it Boston Massacre. Paul Revere, one of the famous leaders of the Sons of Liberty, even wrote the event and called it the Boston Massacre. Sons of Liberty were protesting and demanding representation for taxation. In return, no, but see, you have to understand, these are white people. You have to understand, see, there is a reason to why these guys are not even demanding independence because at the end of the day, both are white and both come from the same ancestry, the Gore Langur ancestry. That's probably the reason why they were not actually asking for freedom. It was not even a dominion status they were asking. They were just saying representation de do. Hmm. In Telugu, we have a song, Nidi Tanali, Nadi Tanali. Just like that. At the end of the day, this is white man and white man. Boston Massacre. And the way Boston Massacre was reported is like massive brutality by British on the colonists. 5 colonists killed in firing. Yeah, these are all newspaper clippings of how the paintings were done in the newspapers. Oh, yes. So Boston Massacre did not go very well. And even British took a conciliatory approach. So British were like, "ठीक है, okay, we understand you're angry. So all the taxes, duties, acts which were passed previously, Navigation Act, Sugar Act, Quartering Act, Stamp Act, etc., they were all waived off. So American colonies were given complete exemption from taxation except tea, tea tax. Except tea. The reason why tea was selected is number one, Americans actually are a coffee batch, so they're not heavy tea drunkards. So not many people get actually impacted by tea. And by putting tea tax, also the crown will have an upper authority saying we did not give up. We still have a tax coming from America. वो जो British sense of ego, British sense of ego will sort of prevail. That in the end, we did not really surrender. We still have a tax coming. But 1772 Tea Act was passed in which Americans were required to pay tax for the tea which they get. But large set of Americans were like, no, we will not pay tax even for tea. Give us representation, we will pay. So basically, to protest against this tea tax is what we call the Boston Tea Party. Boston Tea Party. Basically, what they did, the Tea Act was passed. So British Parliament passed a law which lowered the price of tea, but still leaves a tax on the tea. Colonists actually saw the tax on tea as a direct attack on them. In several cities, Sons of Liberty did things to protest this law. In Boston, the Sons of Liberty held the Boston Tea Party. Basically, what the Boston Tea Party meant is the colonists, members of the Sons of Liberty, will board a ship of East India Company, and they threw all the tea, nearly 2.5 million tons of tea, into the sea. In fact, they called it Tea Party. By throwing the tea, Americans were clearly sending a symbolic message that we won't accept. Now, obviously, British came back with brutality. The funny part is in the entire story, East India Company became bankrupt. मियाँ बीवी के झगड़े में डूब गया काशी. Americans wanted representation, British wanted arrogance. East India Company was like, why did you throw our tea, man? We are not even involved in this. हमको क्या पता. So Boston Tea Party. Sons of Liberty, dressed as Mohawk Indians, boarded the ships in Boston Harbor. They dumped crates of tea into the harbor as a protest against the Tea Act. Boston Tea Party. Company lost money actually in the entire story. The minute Boston Tea Party happened, British Parliament came back with another set of laws. called the 1774 Intolerable Act. That is, it had four acts. No political meetings were permitted. Boston port was closed for all Americans. Everybody involved in the Boston Tea Party was to be arrested, and their properties were to be sold off or mortgaged off to pay the compensation for tea. In response, Americans came back with another protest. They all met in September 1774 at Philadelphia, called the First Philadelphia Congress or First Continental Congress. Colonists took action. I mean, they actually saw the intolerable acts again as British arrogance. एक तो पहले से टी एक्ट पे खुश नहीं थे, ऊपर से ब्रिटिश वर कमिंग विद मोर ब्रूटल एक्ट्स. Things did not go very well. People started to get very, very angry, and the colonists declared that they are going to boycott all British goods. They're going to create a private American army called the Militia Army, and they sent an appeal to the king. So in September 1774, they sent a, you can say, grievance letter in the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia, or the First Philadelphia Congress. Even, see, this is very similar to, remember the Albany plan? Albany Congress, yesterday I told you, similar to that. Again, the colonial leaders are meeting at one place. They were planning to raise their issue. They were planning to tell कि यार मैडम ये गलत है, don't do this to us. So very similar to the Albany plan, and they created a meeting. Now the funny part is, in 1775, another Second Continental Congress met. In the First Continental Congress, they sent a list of grievances. In the 1774 Congress, they sent a list of grievances to the king. Complaint list भेजा था कि हमारे साथ ये हुआ है, हमको बेइज्जती हुई है, गजब बेइज्जती and all that. No response came from London. The king did not care to respond. I did not even care to answer. So they met again, this time again in 1775, and finally it was decided that no more requisitions. America declared that they are going to form a union and they're going to separate from Britain. And they selected a draft committee to draft reasons for separation. This reasons for separation is basically the complaint list. Thomas Jefferson was selected to write the document. Now, see, from 1750 to 1775, 1754 to 1775, don't you think it is not wrong to actually blame Britain for American independence? Because Americans never wanted independence. Britain kept on ignoring them to a point where they just could not take Britain anymore. Right? Agreed. So at every stage, whenever Americans were raising a grievance, Britain was just only ignoring them. That's it. Nothing else. सिर्फ बेकार का इग्नोर कर रहा था. Don't you see an exact similarity the way they treated Indians as well? Even in India, we never wanted independence in the first place. No, we only wanted representation. They did not give us. Then we wanted dominance status. They did not give us. Since they were continuously ignoring us, we went for independence. Right? Mm. Finally, on the 4th of July, 1776, the Declaration of Independence was signed. The Declaration was written by Thomas Jefferson, generally known as the birth certificate of United States, also the first written constitution. It documented the listed rights and grievances against King George III. Basically, all the complaints they wrote in one page, one side. They wrote 12 fundamental rights on the first front side. Everybody signed it here like this. You can see the signatures here. All of them signed like this, and this became the Constitution of America. This is the Constitution. It had four parts. Number one, preamble, we the people of United States, etc. Then Declaration of Rights, Article 1 to Article 12. Then list of grievances, complaints, key, what are the complaints Americans have towards the British? And then the resolution that they are declaring themselves independent. स्ट्रेट फॉरवर्ड, इसलिए 2 पेज में खत्म हो जाता है इनका कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन. Their constitution ends in 2 pages. See, once in Declaration of Independence was done, John Hancock was the first to sign this document, and anyone who signed this document was to be caught and hanged. That's what the rule of American colonies was. But the colonists were very, very strong. So at this point, America, I mean, there were two groups: colonists, loyalists. Loyalists were those who wanted to stay with Britain, who had no complaints with Britain. They believed in King George III. Colonists were those who wanted independence. They were the loyalists. Both the parties actually under believed that they would win the war. Americans were actually, I mean, in a way, Americans had more greater confidence because between 1776 to 1783, the American colonists and the British army fought against each other. There was physical battle, physical war which happened. The main advantages for the Americans were actually not fighting for economy. They were fighting for their home, families, freedom, life, survival itself. They were headed by George Washington. They were fighting for their home ground. Benjamin Franklin even was able to gain the French help. This time, the French were ready to help the American colonies against the British because the French only wanted destruction of British. Who does it is irrelevant. ब्रिटिश का खात्मा चाहिए बस. कैसे होगा, कौन करेगा, इससे कोई फर्क नहीं पड़ता. The British must end. That's it. Who will do it? How they will do it is irrelevant. So this time, the French actually supported the colonies. French came for the help of colonies. Many English generals who were afraid to make mistakes could not really take a decision, and English people would get. I mean, eventually, British were very, very tired. Common English citizens were tired because they never understood the logic of fighting for a colony which is on the other side of the world and who are also white by culture anyway. मतलब लॉजिक नहीं था इस झगड़े का. No reason, no purpose. And for the British, the problems were they were very poorly trained. British actually had no naval support. They had no money to fight a war. British population two-thirds was Tories. Tories is basically conservatives, the Tory party. And those people they never cared for any other country other than Britain. And the Hessians, Red Indians, they were all against the colonies. And many of the British people were also white. So they did not understand why they were fighting a white man. Eventually, in the year 1783, British were defeated by the colonial army. In fact, to put in our perspective, George Washington defeated Cornwallis. This is the same Cornwallis after 3 years who was sent to India. And Cornwallis was sent to India mainly to fix all the problems which could eventually lead to American type of problems in future in India. That is why when Cornwallis came, he focused on reforms, where he tried to remove in existence of Indians in authority, existence of Indians in power, where he attacked Indians, he discriminated Indians. That was all part of a strategy because India is by this time they used to call India the uh, jewel in the British crown. They used to call India the jewel in the British crown. So they had to get this done. General Cornwallis surrendered to the Americans, marking the end of war, marking the end of American colonization. See, now you can actually try to connect this to Cornwallis and why Cornwallis was so brutal with Indians and why his entire administration was about greater control, greater authority for British in India, and why he was continuously emphasizing on that aspect. क्योंकि उसको गलती नहीं दोहराना था. I mean, he did not want the mistake to be redone. Finally, in the Battle of Yorktown, Lord Cornwallis surrendered in the Battle of Yorktown. Now, what are the consequences? Or you can say there's a question which comes regularly in mains: significance of American Revolution. Number one, America got independence. The American Revolution was actually fought by the masses, not by the classes. It was in reality nationalists against imperialists, those who believed in colonization versus those who believed in American nation. It is a proper war. America actually got independence. Now, also, American Revolution had a domino effect. In fact, in a way, it actually started the age of revolutions. 1789, French Revolution. 1798, Irish Revolution. 1830, Latin American revolutions. Even sorry, 20th century decolonization. All of this was based on American Revolution because American Revolution is actually the first instance where the colony is defeating a colonizer. Colony is defeating a colonizer. It is American Revolution for the first time. Then, even in Europe, American Revolution got a lot of support. The problem is French king at that time, Louis the 15th, sent his forces and army to support Americans against the British. यहाँ पे एक छोटा सा प्रॉब्लम था. French king was sending an army to the colonies. The problem was the colonies got independence. British got a lesson of how to not rule the colonies. Nobody knows what the French got other than a big bill for their war. कुछ भी नहीं मिला. Economically, France became very weak. Participation in the American Revolution, supporting Americans in their independence movement, cost France its economy, because of which eventually the French Revolution happened. Ante, Anudeep, that's it. Mansik Santulan, that's it. Mansik psychological happiness, nothing else. France were absolutely dumb to actually get involved in this battle. It was not their battle. It had nothing to do with them. And for Britain, Britain learned a beautiful lesson about how to rule their future colonies, particularly that can you now you understand the link between this? 1 year, Cornwallis surrendered. Immediately 1 year later, William Pitt the Younger, the British Prime Minister, introduces Pitt's India Act, taking full control of the colony of India. Pitt's India Act, 1784. So how American Revolution is continuously impacting Indian authority or Indian rule, British rule in India. And in 1786, 2 years later, Lord Cornwallis is made the Governor General of India, or Governor General of Bengal. He's sent to India mainly to make sure the American mistakes do not repeat again. The logic was pretty simple. Cornwallis was coming with a single point agenda that the American mistakes will not repeat back in India. And India will remain free as it is. India will remain a British colony as it is. And eventually, the United States of America was established as a federal state with ideals of liberty, rule of law, equality of white man in their principles. 13 colonies eventually merged into a single colony. First written and democratic constitution of the world was there. Now, I'll tell you one problem here. It is actually a little controversial to call this the first democratic constitution because, number one, this entire United States I'm actually talking is white man's United States. The black, the red Indian, native Indians have no right to, they kind of don't exist. The second problem is we are only talking about man's vote. We are not talking about women's vote. Women, underprivileged people, poor people, they don't have any right to vote here. They kind of don't exist. So that's also another problem. So we are not talking about freedom and free speech and democracy. So technically, although it is namesake democracy, it really did not have all the democratic principles in it. So if you observe, what all led to the British challenges is French Indian War, Proclamation Act, Stamp Act, Quartering Act, Tea Tax 1772, Intolerable Act 1774, Lexington Accord or Battle of Bunker Hill, also called the last battle, where Cornwallis surrendered. Now, what was American reactions to French Indian War? They did not want to pay share of war. They did not want to pay. With when Proclamation Act, that is, Americans should not cross Appalachian Mountains, was passed, Americans wanted to disobey the law. And what was the reaction to Stamp Act? Protests, creation of Sons of Liberty, boycott of British goods, and the famous slogan, no taxation without representation. When Quartering Act was passed, Boston Massacre happened. People protested, 5 Americans were killed. Then, when Tea Act was passed, Boston Tea Party was done. When Intolerable Act, remember the act where tax was put on glass, paint, paper, all that stuff? When that happened, Minutemen or private militia was actually created. No, no, see, Madhav, although in principle it is said that America never didn't follow imperialism, America did follow. America had a colony in Philippines, Haiti, and all that places. Americans were not really that simple. They were really hypocrites because there was one group of Americans who wanted freedom for themselves but not for others. But then there was also the other group of Americans who wanted freedom for all. Okay, that is what eventually leads to the American Civil War at a later stage. In the next stage, American Civil War was this because now what we formed is United States of America consisting of white, only the Gore Langurs. Now, what about Africans? Nobody is talking about the Africans. Nobody talking about the Indians, Red Indians. As of today, Red Indians have got nothing even today. But Africans got their rights in 1861 because a white man stood for them. His name is who formed the Republican Party. and fought for it. And I'll tell you the one funny, interesting fact. You know that America's Democrats are racist. They believe in slavery. They believe that white man has the responsibility to rule the world and civilize the world, while the black man has the responsibility to serve the white man. Whereas Republicans are the true Democrats. Republicans are the people who believe in equality of people, equality of law, rights to everybody, poor people, सबका साथ सबका विकास. It's actually, I mean, the Democratic Party was the strongest supporter of slavery. In fact, Democrats were involved in the Dred Scott's case in 1863. There's a case called Dred Scott's case. Dred Scott was a black who wanted freedom because his owner died. Democrats fought this case against Dred Scott. In fact, thank American Supreme Court in 1858, sorry, 1858, actually declared that a black man cannot demand liberty, human rights, and free speech because he is not human but rather a primate, and primates do not have human rights. American Supreme Court said this. Madhav, the basis for discrimination has always been Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. Darwin believed that there was chimpanzees, then there were the gorillas, then there were the black, then slowly they became white. So white man is the highest level of human evolution. You know how we have Homo erectus, Homo sapien, just like that. Just like that. So by all standards, Americans are the dumbest people. No doubt in that. Okay. So that's the story of American Revolution, guys, and how the 13 colonies eventually became one colony and how they developed into a single act. Now you can understand this slide, all the issues started from French Indian War, then eventually went to a series of acts and the laws passed by the British. And all the way through, you can comfortably blame the British only for American independence, right? Totally comfortably we can blame British only for American independence. Otherwise, Americans would have never got independence in the first place. If Americans had literally given those 13 MPs, which the American, if Britain had given those MPs, members of parliament in the parliament, Americans would have even not even thought of anything like this. Right? So, guys, I've given a small hint. So, French Revolution actually starts in the backdrop of this only. So, when Benjamin Franklin was fighting Lord Cornwallis, he took help from a guy called Lafayette. Lafayette was a French general who was supporting the American colonies against the British. Eventually, after this war, French economy started to dismantle completely. There were also structural problems in the French society and the French economy. Supported by these American returning French people who were coming with the ideas of liberty, equality, civil rights, and free speech. All of this together led to the French Revolution in 1786-87. Okay, French Revolution, we will begin in the next class, guys. So that's the two parts of American Revolution. Thank you. You have a nice day. I'll see you in the next class with the beginning of French Revolution. Okay, guys. Keep watching. Subscribe to this YouTube channel. Keep following. You have a nice day. Bye bye.